Monster Hunter Rise is one of the most user-friendly Monster Hunter games out there, but if you want to take on the toughest content effectively, you're going to need a build fit for taking on the deadly monsters. So I'm Darcblade with some awesome builds for the bow in Monster Hunter Rise. Now these are builds that I personally like to use in the game. They may not be the most meta out there, but they are aimed at taking on the majority of hunts Monster Hunter Rise has to offer. For this first series I'll be featuring between 3 and 4 builds for each of the various weapons, which should cater to a variety of playstyles. When it comes to the bow in Monster Hunter Rise, it's a very strong damage dealing weapon. Could almost be a glass cannon in some respects, as you're not able to take a lot of punishment. This kind of balances things out. With that in mind, most of the builds I use for the bow are DPS focused, and its defense comes in the form of a player's skill and being able to avoid attacks. So the first build is the high DPS elemental bow build. This build is an interchangeable build, so it can use pretty much any element in the game. The armor pieces remain the same, the only things that change are the bow you're using, as well as the jewels to match the element of that said bow. So for this build, first of all you'll need the mighty bow feather, as well as the Vikmail-esque, Giratoda's van braces, chrome metal coil, and the Rachna greaves. As for the petalace, I would recommend using either the demon petalace for DPS, or if you want something a little bit more balanced, the underworld petalace. As for your talisman, well, this is a tricky part as not everyone will have access to the same talismans, but if you can get a talisman with either weakness exploit or the physique skill that has a couple of jewel decoration slots, you should be able to build a similar build. As for the weapons, now this is where things get interesting. When it comes to the bow, obviously you have to take into account the elemental type of the bow, but also the arrow types. Whether you prefer piercing, spread, or rapid arrows, these can all dictate what bow you choose. Spread shots are obviously good when it comes to close range combat, great against the smaller monsters. Piercing ammunition allows the arrows to pierce through monsters, so it's great against longer, larger monsters, and a rapid is a happy medium. Now for the purpose of this video I'll be demonstrating the Arachna Torch bow, but if you're going for a fire bow I'd either take the said Arachna Torch or Dark Filament. When it comes to water, I'd either recommend taking the Porifera bow or Hell of Mud. For thunder, I'd recommend taking either the Flying Kodachi Striker or the Despot's Early Bolt. For ice, I'd recommend either taking Diora's Sagittari or Heaven's Glaze. And for dragon, I'd recommend the Red Naught Dragon Arc. Failing this, if you want something more simple, you can always craft yourself the Rampage bow with the corresponding element that you wish. As for the ramp up skills, these are kinda down to personal preference. Either go for element exploit if they have it, if not, either try to increase the raw attack of the bow or the elemental attack of the bow. Now when it comes to the decorations, you've got a fair few to play around with here given the armor pieces we've chosen. First of all, I'd recommend taking a Tenderizer jewel so we can max out the weakness exploit skill. Afterwards, take Blaze jewels to max out the fire attack of this build as we are using a fire bow. Of course, if you were using a different bow with a different element, you replace those Blaze jewels to match whatever new element you were using. So if you were using a thunder bow, you would replace the Blaze jewels with the bolt jewels. If you were using an ice bow, you would replace the Blaze jewels with frost jewels, so on and so forth. Regardless, we're aiming to max out the elemental attack. Afterwards, we're going to take jewels to max out the main arrow types of the bow. So as the Arachna Torch is mainly pierce arrows, we're going to go with pierce jewels to max out the pierce up skill. Of course, if your bow mainly had rapid type arrows, you'd replace the pierce jewels with force shot jewels, and if you had spread arrows, you'd replace the pierce jewels with spread jewels. Anyway, next up you'll need a physique jewel to get constitution to at least level 3. And then the jewels become personal preference in some respects. Because we are using the Arachna Torch that has a few spare jewel sockets, we're able to give this build a quick load, which allows the arrow coatings to be automatically selected. We're also able to take a refresh jewel to max out stamina surge, and we're also able to take a critical jewel to give us 1 point in critical boost. Now it would be nice to get more points in critical boost, but because the bows normally have such low raw attack, that extra 10% damage isn't always necessarily worth it, especially when compared to maxing out stamina surge and having better stamina management. Personally, when it comes to the bow, I like to have a fair amount of stamina management skills, even on top of the dash juice, which may be a waste to some, but it allows for more sustained DPS. Also, if you run out of stamina, you cannot dodge effectively, and thus you risk getting hit. But one thing to remember when it comes to the decorations, as I mentioned, the Arachna Torch does have a few fair decoration slots in it, so you may be restricted when you use other bows to what you can use. You may have to drop the critical jewel, the extra refresh jewel, or even the quick load in order to get an effective build. Just remember to prioritize the weakness exploit, your elemental attack, constitution to at least level 3, and max out whatever your primary arrow type is. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 195 raw attack with a fire rating of 43. You'll have 30% base affinity, which can easily be 80% when you take into account weakness exploit. You'll also have a strong defense of 409. That is fairly resistant to fire and water, a little bit weak to dragon, but unfortunately very weak to thunder and ice. As for the switch skills, with every weapon in the game, these are going to be technically down to your own personal preference. I'm not going to tell you how to play the weapon, play how you want to play. But when it comes to the skills on this build, first of all, you'll have fire attack at level 5, increasing the fire damage of this build. Of course, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace fire attack to match whatever new element you were using. So if you were using a dragon bow, for example, it will be dragon attack level 5. Anyway, you have weakness exploit at level 3. Weakness exploit is a skill that increases our affinity whenever we're attacking monster weak points. Should we attack a monster weak point with weakness exploit at level 3, it will grant us a bonus 50% affinity to that attack. You'll also have Constitution at level 3, decreasing the cost of stamina consuming moves, which is essential for the bow. You only really need to get Constitution to level 3 to be honest with the bow though, because this can be topped up with dash juice, giving us the effect of having Constitution at level 5. You have Stamina Surge at level 3, another quality of life and stamina management skill that allows our stamina to recharge and refill itself at a quicker pace. Please be aware that not all bow builds will have Stamina Surge at level 3 and maybe only level 2. You'll also have Pierce Up at level 3, increasing the raw attack damage of piercing shots. Of course, much like the elemental attack in this build, if you were using a bow with a different arrow type, you'd replace pierce arrows with either spread up or normal / rapid fire up to increase the damage of those said arrows. Anyway, you have reload speed level 2. Reload speed is really only applicable to this build as we are using the Arachna Torch bow, which allows us to automatically equip coatings whenever we select them. You also have critical boost at level 1, increasing the raw damage of our attacks should they crit a monster. This increase in damage is 30%, but like I said, it only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion. And as the bows normally have quite low raw attack, I've only really gone for 1 point in critical boost. Finally, you'll have Bow Charge Plus at level 1, which is an essential skill for the bow as it allows us to charge up the bow one more level. So most bows can only charge up to level 3, this will allow us to get to level 4, ultimately giving us an increase in damage once we reach that final stage and start dash dancing around a monster. Unfortunately, there are no set bonuses with this build, but when it comes to the bow, there's not a lot of set bonuses that benefit the weapon. But regardless, if you're looking for an effective elemental build to use against pretty much any monster in the game, so long as you switch the bow to match the monster's elemental weakness, you can't go wrong with this build. It's strong, it's powerful, it's highly customizable as well. You can always swap in more critical jewels if you so want and reduce your stamina jewels. The choice as always is up to you, but every build out there has pros and cons. The biggest pro for this build is its damage output, mainly in terms of its elemental damage. For the bow, it has okay raw attack, which can add to its overall DPS, but so long as you're countering the monster with the correct element, this bow build can bring them down fast and effectively. On top of that, this build is highly customizable, being able to swap to a bow with any element as well as match the arrow types. It means that this build can be used to pretty much counter any monster in the game. And then finally for the pros is that even if you don't use dash juice, this build is quite good when it comes to stamina management, which allows us for sustained DPS and more importantly, a little bit of extra stamina when it comes to avoiding attacks. But of course, every build out there has cons. The two biggest cons for this build include the fact that this build is a decoration heavy build, meaning that you'll need a fair amount of decorations to get it working. Okay, decorations are not that hard to come by in Monster Hunter Rise when compared to Monster Hunter World and Iceborne, but it's still going to be an endgame build for you. And the other con is unfortunately this is a glass cannon build. You're going to be able to dish out a lot of damage, but you're not going to be able to take a lot of hits. You can counter this slightly if you so wish by making sure that you collect enough spirit birds to increase your health, but even then, taking a hit normally means that you have to stop your assault and heal, otherwise you won't be able to take a second or especially a third hit. But regardless, this is my current go-to bow build. It's one I use all the time for myself when I'm hunting alone or hunting in a group. I find it fast, efficient, able to take down monsters sub 5 minutes so long as you're countering them with the correct elements and switching the decorations to match whatever bow you are using, making it one of my personal favourites. Which brings us on to the next build, which is the raw attack bow build. Now the bow is pretty much the master when it comes to elements, but it can use raw builds, especially when combined with certain armor pieces. Raw bow builds may not deal as much damage as the elemental ones, but it means you can go on multi-monster hunts without having to go back to camp to change your armor or bow, and these builds are also great for when it comes to taking on rampages, as the counter signal mainly affects raw attack rather than anything else. So for this build, we're going to need the entire Valstrax armor, which includes the Valstrax helm, Valstrax mail, Valstrax bracers, Valstrax coil, and Valstrax greaves. Again, when it comes to the petalace, I would recommend either the Underworld or Demon petalaces. As for the Talisman, again, much like the first build, it depends what you have available to you. For this build, I'm using a Constitution Talisman that has a tier 3 and tier 2 decoration slot in it. Now, when it comes to the bow, there is a bow you have to use for this build, which is the Tyrant Bow. There are multiple reasons for using the Tyrant Bow. First of all, it has the highest raw attack in the game, for the bows at least anyway. And on top of that, it is also the only bow that can get to charge level 4 without using the bow charge plus feather, allowing us to use the full set of Valstrax armor. Other bows require that bow charge plus skill to increase their maximum charge level, but the Tyrant Bow does not. And if we were to use the Mighty Bow Feather on this build, it would just be wasted, as a bow cannot go beyond charge level 4. So when it comes to the decorations, first of all, I'd recommend taking Pierce Jaws to increase the Pierce arrow types, as this bow primarily uses Pierce arrows, especially in the later charge levels, which will be dealing the most amount of damage. I'd also recommend taking Critical Jaws to max out the crit boost skill. I then recommend a Physique Jaw to get Constitution to at least level 3. And then the remaining jaws are kinda down to personal preference, in all honesty. I've gone for simply a Brace Jaw for a point in flinch free, which is great for multiplayer, and Steadfast Jaws to give us the stun resistance skill. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 265 raw attack with no element. You'll have minus 12% affinity, which is kind of nasty, but this can be complemented and countered slightly thanks to weakness exploit, giving us technically 38% affinity. You have a very strong defense of 546 that is unfortunately weak to every element, but very strong against dragon. As for the skills, first of all, you have Dragon Heart at level 5. Dragon Heart is a result of having the 5-piece Valstrax armor set. Basically, when our health drops below 80%, we'll contract Dragon Blight. This will increase all our elemental resistances to 50 and will also gain 10% increased raw attack. Now, Dragon Blight would nullify the effects of our elemental damage, thus the reason that this build works so well with raw attack builds. Anyway, next up is Resentment at level 3, which gives us increased raw attack should there be a portion of red health on our health bar. You'll also have Resuscitate at level 3. Resuscitate is a skill that grants us 20% raw attack whenever we have a blight on our hunter. And as Dragon Blight should be active for the majority of a hunt with this build, Resuscitate should be active for the majority of a hunt too. You also have Critical Boost at level 3, again increasing the damage of our critical hits. You have Weakness Exploit at level 3, Constitution at level 3, Pierce Up at level 3. You have Stun Resistance at level 3, preventing any stuns on our hunter. You also have Fire Resistance at level 1. This is a byproduct of the talismans we're wearing. It just simply increases our fire resistance slightly. You also have Flinch Free level 1, another optional skill. Flinch Free is kind of essential when you're playing in a group, as it prevents other hunters from knocking you down. It will also resist very minor monster attacks as well. So there you have it. That is the raw DPS bow build that I tend to use. Again, it is highly customizable and you can swap out some decorations here and there. For example, the build does, yes, have lower affinity, so you can drop some points if you wanted to from critical boost and put them in other skills if you wanted to. This build is also quite risky when it comes to the glass cannon elements of the bow, as you need to really get to that 80% health threshold in order to get the most DPS out of this build. But if you're able to do that, you'll have a bow build that can take on any monster in the game. But of course, every build out there has pros and cons. The biggest pro for this build is its raw attack damage output, especially when Dragonheart, Resentment and Resuscitate are in effect. This means that you don't necessarily have to worry about a monster's elemental resistances to deal decent damage. It also means that this build is very effective at taking on rampages. The other pro is that this build doesn't need the Mighty Bow Feather, meaning that it frees up a lot of options when it comes to creating builds and using set bonuses. And finally, the other pro is the Dragonheart set bonus itself, which increases our overall attack and elemental defense. But unfortunately there are cons. Much like the first build, again this is a decoration heavy build requiring a lot of decorations to make work. And the other con is, unfortunately, this build requires hunters to lose a portion of health in order for you to deal maximum damage. But if you're comfortable with that, you're going to have one of the strongest raw attack bow builds in the game, which can be great when it comes to taking on multiple monsters, and you don't always like to go back to camp and change out your build to match the element of whatever monster you're facing. Which brings us on to the final build, which is the budget bow build. Now, I've covered budget builds in the past. These are builds made up of simple armor pieces and decorations. With Monster Hunter Rise, this series of budget builds will be complete armor sets, meaning that you don't have to farm multiple monsters, you can just focus on farming one monster, get that full armor set from that said monster, which will benefit the weapon in question. So for when it comes to the bow, the monster we're going to be farming is Zenoga, and we're going to be crafting the full Zenoga armor set, which includes the Zenoga Helm S, Mail S, Braces S, Coil S, and Greaves S. As for the Petalace, either go with the Demon or Underworld Petalace. And then for your talismans, if you can get hold of one that has weakness exploit with some decoration slots, that's what you want to go for. As for the bow, because this is going to be a budget build aimed at taking on pretty much any monster without having to constantly switch the bow, we're going to go for the Tyrant Bow again. If you can't get to the Tyrant Bow, just go with the Diablos tree and you'll have similar results. Now when it comes to the decorations, like I said, these aren't essential and you can pretty much get a decent build without actually having these decorations if you don't have them. But if you can, get critical jaws to max out the crit boost skill, a pierce jaw to give us a point in pierce up, steadfast jaws for stun resistance, quick load jaws for reload speed, and a brace jaw for flinch free. Like I said, most of these are optional, and as this is a budget beginner build, not everyone will have access to them. But anyway, if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build that has a raw attack of 265 with no element. You have minus 12% affinity, which again will be 38% affinity when you take into account weakness exploit. It will be even higher at 88% affinity when you take into account latent power as well, which we'll talk about in a minute. You have strong defense of 456, that is very strong against thunder, strong against fire and dragon, but unfortunately weak to water and especially ice. Now when it comes to the skills, first of all you'll have Latent Power at level 5. Latent Power is a great skill when it comes to Monster Hunter Rise. Basically, whenever you've been fighting a monster for a set amount of time, or you've taken a certain amount of damage from that said monster, Latent Power buff will kick in. This will increase your affinity by 50% and reduce your stamina depletion by another 50%. And when it comes to Monster Hunter Rise, as you spend a fair amount of time collecting spirit birds on the way to a monster, normally after you've engaged the monster, the buff is already about to kick in, making it a great skill for the bow. Anyway, you also have Weakness Exploit at level 3, Constitution at level 3. To be honest, you could potentially drop a point in Constitution if you so wish, and rely on the reduced stamina depletion buff that Latent Power provides. The choice is up to you. Anyway, you also have Stun Resistance at level 3, which is great for beginners. You have Critical Boost at level 2, Reload Speed at level 2, Pierce Up at level 1, and finally Flinch Free at level 1. So there you have it, that is the beginner armor set I would recommend if you're going for a budget build. Latent Power gives us 2 huge buffs for the bow, making it incredibly useful. Not only does it take us a fair amount of time, but of course every build out there has pros and cons. The biggest pros for this build is its decent damage output. Whilst it's not the best damage output out there, it's still nonetheless decent when it comes to raw attack, able to take on pretty much any monster in the game without having to worry about their elements. The other pro is the Latent Power at level 5. Latent Power is a wonderful skill for the bow. As I mentioned, you normally spend a fair amount of time collecting spirit birds on the way to a monster, which means that the buff is normally active by the time you actually engage the monster, which will grant us increased affinity, increasing our DPS, and stamina management. On top of that, because the bow is such a glass cannon, when you do take a hit from a monster, you take a substantial hit, meaning that the buff can normally be reactivated by just simply taking a hit or two. And then finally for the pros is that again this is a bow that does not need the Mighty Bow Feather. The Mighty Bow Feather, for those of you who are not aware, is acquired by completing each of the arena quests, which can be difficult. So that is why we are primarily using the Diablos bow, so we're able to get that maximum charge level without having to have that armor piece, which contains the Bow Charge Plus skill. But unfortunately there are cons. The biggest cons for this build include the fact that you have to rely on the Latent Power buff to deal maximum DPS with this build, which is something you cannot always control. And the other con, which is more of a con for the bow in general, which again you may feel like a glass cannon with this build, meaning that you'll only be able to take maybe 2-3 hits before you faint. But if you're looking for a beginner build to take on the monsters, especially when you get to endgame with the bow, I'd strongly recommend this build. So there we have it, those are some of the builds that I like to use for the bow. Now these builds are aimed to be general builds, able to take on the majority and pretty much any task in Monster Hunter Rise. They also may be slightly different from other meta builds found in the community. They can also differ depending on what charms and decorations you have available. But regardless, these are some of the builds that I personally like to use in the game, and I hope they help you out in your hunts. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you some amazing builds for the bow in Monster Hunter Rise. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.